I'd like to introduce you to today's presenter, Alana Olive-Smith. Alana is an instructional designer for the content development team at GP Strategies. She received an MS in Instructional Technology from Bloomsburg University in Pennsylvania and a BA in English from Arcadia University. She enjoys mixed martial arts, comics, and movies. And I must say, I did learn this recently, that she is actually the national champion in, remind me, is it kickboxing?
Yes, Muay Thai.
Very, very cool. And she's going to the World Championships here soon. So Alana, I will go ahead and turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you, Kayla, for that introduction. And considering that we do have a very short amount of time, I'll just go right ahead and get us started. So I'm going to start us off with this image that I'm sure a lot of you have seen before, which is by Burson, by Deloitte. And it says Meet the Modern Learner, but this could also very much apply to the modern worker. We have more work squeezed in each day. We're using mobile devices more and more, and we're often overwhelmed, distracted, impatient because we have a very, very little amount of time to actually get stuff done. So with this, one of the reasons that microlearning is exploding is because of all those factors. It's becoming the adopted paradigm in town because we're so pressed for time, because we need a shorter and easier way to get information. So the way we're defining microlearning is that we're providing learners with tiny bites of learning material, like you see in that in the clips of mango. Now, it can be grouped in different ways, which is why we've got some mango scattered out, some in a bowl, and some all together in a bag. Now, just because something is short doesn't mean it's microlearning. It is typically 2 to 3 minutes in length max, and ideally less than 5, but just watching any sort of video or any sort of learning content doesn't mean that it's microlearning. Now, with microlearning, one of the things that we're getting out of it is that it's making it more learner-centric, giving the learner more choice and control over their learning and leading to higher engagement and increased productivity. So let's look at how microlearning is best used. It does not replace the overall macro learning. Just because you've got some microlearning doesn't mean you can skip the overall training on how to do something as a whole. Now, if we look at this slide here, you'll see the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. And this is one of the places where microlearning comes in very well for things like product and process updates, just-in-time learning, communicating changes over time, and supplementing your primary macro learning. Now, with the way our brains work, we're not going to remember something if we just see it once. Sure, some people will, but that is really statistically an outlier. The way we learn things best is by spaced repetition, which you can see over there. Actually, if you review something every day, that's not as effective as spacing it out, like you'll see here. So if your company has some changes to perhaps its company motto or some minor product changes, microlearning would be a good way to change it, saying, hey, our packaging is blue now, and we've changed our slogan from this to this. Also, if you look at just-in-time performance support, microlearning comes in very handy there. So if you consider something like, say, a printer jam. Now, unless you're a printer technician or someone else who works in that sort of technological field, that's not necessarily something you would have studied for. But when the time comes and the printer does jam, it's pretty convenient to be able to look at something real quick and be able to resolve the issue without having to go through an extended course. Now, if you were a printer technician, that piece of microlearning would be part of an extended course. Here we go. So some of the best practices for microlearning are shown here. It's flexible, it doesn't overwhelm, it can be taken when there's a need to know, and it can incorporate many different modalities. And that's something that I'm going to give some examples of in a few minutes. And like I mentioned a little earlier, it does produce higher engagement rates and improve retention because they can focus on just one topic at a time. Now, what you're seeing here is a cover to an ebook that Kayla is actually going to distribute to everyone at the end of this presentation, along with the slides of this recording. So I will move on from that for now. And we'll get started by looking at some of the microlearning best practices, now that we've covered some of the basics of what it is. One of the first best practices we want to consider with microlearning is making it micro. Choose one learning objective or insight for training. You can only cover one learning objective in a single microlearning training, so this is what makes it different. So if you look at this image, this is actually a 2-minute video clip going over how to park on a suburban street. So priorities for safety, how to set up the cones, how to park the van, things like that. And with that, you want to keep the message minimal. So if I just want to know how I park on the corner of Havisham and Wicker Street, then this is something that I can access really quickly without going through an entire training on that. So literally at the end of this video, you will know the exact steps and resulting environment for a safe workspace on a roadway. So there are numerous videos as well as a several-week driver's curriculum and inspections, but this video is 2 minutes on safe roadway workspace, period. That's it. That's what this focuses on, one learning objective or insight. So given that first best practice that we've just looked at, let's consider how many microlearnings this should be. Now we could say that it's 8 because we see here it's supposed to be 8 coaching behaviors, or we could say perhaps it's 12 to 13 because there are the 8 coaching behaviors, and then there's the idea at the top, the IDEA, and perhaps one more for like an overview and one more for a conclusion. But what we can take from this is that it should definitely not be one thing. So you can't have one thing and put more than one learning objective, because that takes it away from being microlearning. If I just want a quick dip into, hey, what's the discuss model, then putting it all there would take away completely from the being microlearning, move it away from the 2 to 3 or 5 minute mark, and lose its efficacy. So when we look at microlearning, we can consider it the glue for a multimodal journey. So this is something where you can see throughout this course, and this is something for the D portion of the idea model, that there are different activities throughout. So we've got our internet activities in purple, we've got discussions with a colleague or a coach, assignments in the workplace. And these are all ways to make the microlearning that's spaced in there more effective because they've got more knowledge to contribute it. It's sort of a flipped classroom approach where they can come to with more information and better work through it. So the important item in this type of journey is that the microlearnings need to blend together via sequence. So while they stand alone, they do build from one to the next. So now, because I've gone through why coach others, I'm ready for my coach's checkpoint to come prepared with questions and move on from there. So this speaks to the mango image that we looked at earlier, how you can have just some mangoes scattered around, or you can have mangoes grouped together in a bowl as part of a whole. So microlearning serves best when it's not just one thing that's tossed out there, but rather a complete journey. Now that we've covered that, let's look at the second best practice, and that builds into what I was just saying, which is making it a complete learning experience. Now what you're seeing here is, if I were to click this little question on screen, it would pull up microlearning that's actually embedded in this particular piece of training. So let's just say that I clicked it, we moved on from there. And this is something that helps contribute to that training. So here, when I've clicked on this, it's going to tell me, okay, for this is what you're looking at. These are the people who are going to give you the owner information. So suppliers will give the owner information, and the owner will create the output, or as it was called in this, the artifact. And that is going to be consumed by these roles you see here on the right. Now this microlearning has a couple components. Aside from just saying, okay, this is what you're looking at and what it means and how to use it, it also has the inputs and the coordination that you see here. And this is just sort of a reinforcing tool, making sure that the artifact that they produced here is up to standard. So as we all know, an objective, one of the key components of that is a standard, making sure that what they've actually done is acceptable and usable. So with these inputs, you can see that we've got a sort of checklist here of ways to see, okay, yes, this is complete. And this is helping to reinforce further the knowledge of, okay, well now I'm getting better at going through this particular creation process. So microlearning doesn't just have to be like one quick clip of, hey, this is how you do this. It can also be a reinforcing element saying, hey, this is how you know that you've done this properly. And by, spaced repetition, doing that, the way we saw with the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, you're helping people come more into their own with that. So that was all part of this experience here, and you can see it had several components. And I know we're short on time, so I'm just going to move us right along to best practice 3. And I touched on this earlier, so we're going to go more into it now, multiple modalities. Now, it's just basic neuroscience. We all know that the brain responds differently to different stimuli. You respond differently to a movie than a book, than a ride in the park. So by using different stimuli, like the ones you see here in this obligatory webinar word cloud, those help reinforce ideas and concepts with multiple modalities. So if I see something in maybe a video and also a text format, that's going to help me remember it better than if I just saw it in the video. It helps rewire the brain to further embed the learning. So you can consider multiple micro-learnings and multiple modalities to help really reinforce your points. Now that we've covered that, here you see, let's see, 1, 2, 3 different modalities. You see a micro portal, a mini game, and the ebook you'll be receiving at the end of this seminar. So with mini games, you see this quote here that says, "Research has proven people retain information better when it's presented in a novel way." So content can sometimes be dry and dull, but when you can associate it with a fun and positive experience, it's altogether easier for your learners to recall and retain what they've gone through. So microgames take this concept and they shrink it down to an even easier platform. So if you can build in a quick quiz-based game at the end of each module and reward your learners for their progress, that'll help them have more fun, and that in turn is going to help their retention. And I'm going to actually share my screen for a moment and take us into this dealership operations orientation you see here on the right. Now, considering our time, I'm not going to spend a lot of time in it, but I do want to click through and show you a little bit of it. So I believe you should now be able to see my screen. And let's say that your learner is a new employee at a car dealership. Now, clearly there are several components in a car dealership. There's the front end and the back end. You see here, front and back. But I'm new and I want to know, okay, who are these people in the administration? Just sort of upskill myself or re-go over some things that may have been covered earlier. And you can see here we've got little figure icons with different roles. And so I can pop that up for a quick piece of micro-learning training on, hey, now I know some basics about the general manager. And that's easy enough to click out, and I can return. And further building on our multiple modalities, there's a component here at the bottom with downloadable resources. So if I don't want to go into this every time for a quick refresh, and if I just want to say, hey, I want to download the roles and see what they are, I've got that option here. Now I'm going to take us back into the WebEx and keep us moving right along into best practice 4. Now, best practice 4 is around designing for mobile. One of the first things I said when we looked over that infographic by Deloitte was that people are pretty attached to their phones. People might not always be at their desk per se, but they're usually accessible by phone. People have to travel a lot for work or otherwise get to wherever they need to be, and it's becoming more common for people to work from home. So with that, you want to consider building for mobile as opposed to just a lot of the times we'll find ourselves building for desktop and then doing mobile as a secondary consideration, but with microlearning in particular, you'd like to consider mobile sort of first and primary and the experience on that. You can't build them the same way and expect the same results. So if we look at this here is an example of how I could build something for mobile. Let's say I wanted to learn the different workplace archetypes. So I could click on, say, the networker, and it would pull up the name and have a very clear division, clear block text, something where I wouldn't have to scale or pinch or zoom. So I wouldn't be looking at reading a textbook on my phone. That completely defeats the purpose. You want to build for mobile, and that you want it to be quick and easily accessible. Like this lady here, you can see her walking across the street, which actually could get her fined in Honolulu since they've just implemented the walking and texting fine. But even if she wasn't doing something that's now illegal, we'd want to make it as easy and accessible for her as possible so that she wouldn't not be able to see where she's going, and make it quick and digestible. Now, with designing for mobile, this is actually something that we're also doing internally in my company. So here in my company, we've been developing a coaching app. Now on the left, you see it's got several micro-learning components on how I can become a better coach. And these are things that I could view before I actually go into a coaching session. If we look at the middle screen, then we can see how it guides me through a coaching session with my coachee. So let's say that I have an employee, we'll call him Joe here. This is a way for me to sort of track the session. And post the session, logging the session with Joe, on the far right, there's a way for me to reinforce my own coaching skills, like, hey, did I do this, this, and this, things that I was supposed to do, just so I can sort of see, hey, I really should have asked Joe, or I should have talked less to make this a more collaborative coaching experience. And that was something that we saw earlier in that other piece of microlearning with the inputs and outputs checklist, where it was sort of reinforcing and helping you to become better in more ways than one. So it wasn't just pushing out the content like you see in the far left with those microlearning snippets. It was reinforcing the should-dos and shouldn't-dos. Now, of course, when we talk about building for mobile, this isn't something that you have to do yourself. There are several companies, and I'm not personally promoting any of these. I'm just saying that these are ones that my company has interacted with, and that's why we've put them on here. But it's not something that you have to do on your own. I'll move us along. Now, while we're designing for other companies or for mobile, you can personalize the learning curve. So you can offer examples or additional challenges that will assist your particular learner in whatever they're working through. And this brings us into the next best practice, which is repurposing relevant content and redesigning for the modern workplace. So some things are always going to be relevant, but the way you've presented them might no longer be as applicable. So I'm not going to click us into this video, but I will say that the way they taught fry station things in the 1950s is going to differ from now. These are some quick, easy things like putting the spatula in a clean area, what is and is not acceptable food safety content. And just by having it in a quick video, you can not only see, okay, this is the acceptable way to wear the Arby's hat, you can see, oh, this shouldn't be here by the oil, this should be over there. So in your repurpose and redesign, you want to not only consider abbreviating things to make it micro, focusing on one learning objective, you also want to focus it towards the actual learner that you're dealing with. So here, brand for Arby's. And if we look at best practice 6, we get into that further by making the actual learning personal. Now, a way to do this is, if you look at this, we have a bunch of different toggle switches where I could say, you know what, I really need to work on persuading and influencing, planning and organizing, and creating and innovating. So I can click those, click go, and then it'll have customized content for me and say, okay, well, here's your training on these 3 things you selected. Now, this is a way for me to say, you know what, I'm really great at coping with pressures and setbacks. I don't need to waste my time on that. And that really speaks to the lack of time that people have now. So by being able to customize things for their own personal needs, it's helping them skip over the parts that might not necessarily be relevant to their role or that they might already be exceeding expectations in. Now, I know we're right up against time, so I'm going to move us on to the final best practice, which is including milestones. Now, you don't want your learner to have to slog through a bunch of training, let's say a series of microlearnings, and not know where they are. It helps people to have distinct markers so that they can say, oh, you know what, I'm almost done, or hey, I've gotten like 25, 45% of the way. So we can see one example of that being done here where I can say, oh, you know what, I'm 45% done all of my sales associate outcome training. I've gone through all of my immediate rapport established with customer training, and I've got a little bit left to do with this next topic. So it helps me say, you know what, I'm coming along. There are some areas I still need to work in. But with these milestones, it helps provide a sense of accomplishment and completion, and it also gives people check marks and helps build in breaks, and it helps them celebrate, you know what, I'm really good at this one aspect now. Also, chunking information is a good way to make it easier for your learners to digest it. And social recognition, like badges and media links, can have personal meaning, inspire healthy competition, and just serve as another way to sort of jazz up training to increase engagement and make it more likely that your learners are going to remember what you've been talking about. So that takes us to the end of the presentation, and let's just go over some of the things we talked about. We want to keep it short, focus on one specific component or one learning objective for each microlearning, and in doing that, that feeds into doing the need to know and not the nice to know information. You still want to prepare your learners for what might happen in a negative situation so that they're not floundering, but they might not need to know all of the specifics that, say, a SME would know. So you want to keep it minimal, make sure they're prepared for the best and worst outcomes, and know the general process, how it's supposed to function. Now, microlearning isn't something you just want to throw out there, but something that serves as part of a larger component, so the bag of mangoes, as we saw. And consider how it's going to fit into their daily lives. People are pretty pressed for time, and you want to make sure that your microlearning is actually going to be relevant to their needs. So with that, I am at time, 1 minute over. I do apologize, but I will see if we have any questions.
We certainly do. Well, thank you, Alana. That was you packed a lot into that 20-minute session, I should say. I probably ate up about a minute of it with my housekeeping notes. So you kept it to 20 minutes. That was great. We will run a few minutes over. Those of you who are on can stay on just to answer some of these questions that came in. So if you do have a question for Alana, be sure to enter it into the Q&A module at this time. Obviously, a lot was discussed in the last 20 minutes, and there's still more information that we could talk about. We do encourage you to keep the conversation going with us. Her contact info is right here on the slide, gpstrategies.com. We encourage you to continue the conversation with us. At the beginning of the presentation, she did mention an ebook. We will put out a link to that ebook here shortly as we're going to the Q&A. I will also include the link to the ebook in the email that you will all receive here in the next 24 to 48 hours. This will also include a recording of today's webinar as well as the slides from today. So it looks like we've got a few questions coming in. We'll go ahead and get started with those. The first question is, if I get to personalize learning, how do I make it valid for the overall training?
Well, that is a good question, and with personalizing training, you want to have it as part of an overall component. So you don't want learners to be able to say, you know what, I just really don't like this one topic, I'm not going to train on it. So that's where having microlearning as part of an overall learning serves best. So you can make sure that everyone has base knowledge and use your microlearning to reinforce specific points or serve as a review. Now with that, I see that there is another question, and I will move on to that. And do I think there are any disadvantages with microlearning? Yes, definitely. Now, those disadvantages really come when people try to use it for what it's not meant for, when they try to use it in place of macro learning. So let's say that I was running an oil refinery rig or something along those lines, something with a lot of complicated parts to it. I can't just have one micro-learning on how to drill one type of hole and then expect my employees to know all of the different safety procedures, all of the X, Y, and Z that they would need for me to, one, protect my employees, and two, run a successful business. So micro-learning, because it's been so popular, people are often looking to condense some things that should really be part of a larger journey. And in order to meet client need there, one way to approach that is to go with a macro-learning journey and then have micro-learning components in it, saying, okay, well, these are all the things they need to train in, and let's have these components throughout, which after they go through the training, they can go back to and reference again as they need it. So that way they still end up with micro-learning components, but they're not left with 30 let's see, a 3 or 6 hour seminar that someone has tried to condense into like 3 5-minute videos.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. Another person asked, and I know you touched on this very, very quickly, and I might actually have you slide back to this slide, but asking about the different e-learning tools that can be used for micro-learning or any specific tools that can be leveraged. Do you mind flipping it back to that slide where you shared some of those tools, and we'll go ahead and get those up so folks can see those. I know it was up for a very short amount of time. Everyone will also get a copy of the slide deck, so you'll have access to that as well, in addition to us sharing it today. And so there's one more question coming in, and again, if we need more insights on this, Alana, I'll let you go ahead and we can address this one later. But have you ever had any experience with microlearning in a call center?
Well, in a call center, there's a lot of soft skills training, so it's a lot of emotional intelligence, knowing when people are upset, knowing how to deal with that. I've actually done several trainings on how to handle customers who may be disgruntled because of some sort of problem with something or other that they've had to deal with. Now with that, clearly you want to have an overall training of the expected level of conduct for your particular client. But in there are also, specific snippets of emotion where you can say, you know what, these are the situations that are occurring most commonly, and this is how we can address it. Here are the good ways to do it. Here are the bad ways to do it. So I would definitely say that microlearning can be leveraged in that. And I know that prior to this, you had asked about using different tools to create microlearning. And that's why I flipped back to this slide, because these were all created in different tools. So you see there's an ebook, there's a mini game which was created with something else, and there was a micro portal. So I see that Adobe Captivate and Storyline are mentioned, and all of those can be used for microlearning. Even if you go to, say, YouTube, that can be used for microlearning. It doesn't have to be something necessarily expensive or high-end. It can be something open source throughout your company as long as it's curated in some way. So let's say I needed to change my headlight. Well, I actually did need to change my headlight, and so I looked up the make and model on YouTube and like, okay, well, how do I change my headlight? Now, in doing that, what I did was I looked for the shortest possible video, because I don't want to sit through 17 minutes of someone explaining the history of a headlight. I just want to change my headlight. So with that, yes, you can definitely use different methodologies, but you want to make sure that you're speaking to the needs of your particular audience, and like we said before, keeping it pretty short and relevant. They just want a quick, punchy piece of learning that's going to speak to their needs at the moment.
So we had another question. We actually have a few more questions that came in. I want to be mindful of time, and I don't want to go more than 10 minutes over. So if we do not get to your question, we'll make sure to follow up with you after today's webinar. We'll go ahead and take one more before we close this out. If you do still have a question for Alana, be sure to enter it in the Q&A module, and we'll make sure that we address it. This last question is microlearning simply breaking up a larger course into separate modules? It becomes an option for learners to take the full course or the mini modules.
Okay. With that, I would say that microlearning isn't just breaking up a full course into mini modules, because in there you would lose some of the details. So with microlearning, again, you want to focus on the need to know. So this is just going to be the, hey, I absolutely need to know A, B, and C to do my job. Whereas macrolearning, you want to get more into the details. So with macrolearning, you want to have an overall course that covers everything they need to know, but you could scatter microlearning throughout it as separate modules, things that they can come back to refresh on a particular piece of training. So for instance, one slide that we removed from here because of time spoke to warehouse versus factory storage. Now these were both parts of larger courses on the whole, but this piece of microlearning just covered, hey, here's the difference between the two, so that this particular person would not have to go back through both of those pieces of training just to say, hey, which one am I seeing here and which protocol am I supposed to use? And I hope that that spoke to that question a little bit.
I think it did. Well, we'll go ahead and start wrapping things up. Thank you again to today's speaker, Alana Olive-Smith, and thanks to everyone who attended for your time and attention. We hope that you'll join us again for future Learning Trends webinars. We'll be talking about digital learning here in March, leadership development next week, and content curation later in March. There's obviously more webinars that we can sign up for, and we also have all of our recordings of our previous Learning Trends webinars available on our webinar recordings page at gpstrategies.com. I wish everyone a great day, and thank you again for joining.